Welcome to CSP 340, Chapter 8, Emotional and Behavioral Disorders. The federal definition for emotional and behavioral disorders is problematic. Here's what it says. It says that emotional disturbance means a condition exhibiting one or more of the following characteristics over a long period of time to a marked degree that adversely affects the child's educational performance. So the 5 things that we're looking at. The first one is an inability to learn that can't be explained by intellectual, sensory, or health. You remember in chapter 6, when we were talking about learning disabilities, there was a exclusion clause, and that's the same as this one. An inability to build or maintain satisfactory interpersonal relationships with peers and teachers. We're going to look at that one in just a minute. Inappropriate types of behavior or feelings under normal circumstances. We're going to look at that one. A general, pervasive mood of unhappiness or depression. That word general, remember that one. A tendency to develop physical symptoms or fears associated with personal or school problems. And then it gives this confounding statement. Emotional disturbance includes schizophrenia. The term does not apply to children who are socially maladjusted unless it's determined that they have emotional disturbance. So what is the problem with the definition? The terms that it uses, long period of time and to a marked degree, those are problematic. How long is a long period of time? How much is a marked degree? How far from normal do you have to be, and what's normal anyway? So then there are those level of judgment words: normal, satisfactory, general, compared to whom and determined by whom. Causes problems on that part. And then there's that little weird clause about social maladjustment. It says that a child cannot be emotionally disturbed if they're socially maladjusted unless they're emotionally disturbed. Now, what that was supposed to distinguish between was children that just hung out with a bad crowd versus those who had emotional problems and hung out with a bad crowd. But that phrase has been used to turn kids away from services by saying, no, they're not disturbed, they're just socially maladjusted. In Mississippi, this had the effect of many children who should have been getting services for emotionally disturbed being put in mental hospitals or ending up in juvenile detention facilities. So now we're going to look at types and characteristics. Now I'm going to show you a lot of little mini films here because I think the best way to understand the different types is just actually to see them in action. So we're going to start with anxiety disorders, and there are several kinds, but first we're going to look at general anxiety.
See many times anxiety disorder, what does that mean? Increasingly, children are coming in with higher and higher rates of anxiety disorders. Now, anxiety tends to run in families. It tends to be genetic, but still, it's the stress and the pressure that seems to be bringing it out now in earlier ages. When I first started my practice, I really didn't get many kids complaining of anxiety. It seems to be becoming so common. I have kids who, out of anxiety, some of the symptoms of anxiety, obviously nervousness, worry, anticipating dreadful events. Their mother leaves driving somewhere, they're afraid she's going to have a car accident. They have to call her on the cell phone 5 times to make sure she's okay. We all know about the little kindergartner who goes into his first day of kindergarten. He's clutching his mom's hand, and all the other children are separating from their parents. He's clinging and has to be coached and cajoled into the school building.
And is this a kind of disorder that's treatable with talking or needing medication?
If it's really heavily family genetic, they're often, not necessarily in childhood years, but very often eventually medication does have to get used, especially if you get a school refusal. We call it school refusal or school phobia. And there you get a situation where a kid is terrified of going into school and they're not making it up. It's not a kid who's being defiant and oppositional. Those kids often will need some medication. They tend to give them very light medications to help with their nerves. But no, most of these things can be treated without medication.
So we're going to look at some of the different kinds of anxiety disorders. We're going to start by looking at OCD.
Compulsive disorder. If a kid always has it and seizure, that's one type of obsessive compulsive disorder flavor. You discuss that, and I'll tell you a different one.
Okay. Well, the parent calls in and says that their child has these rituals that they have to count a certain number of things before they go to sleep at night. They have to line their little toys up a certain way. And if the house cleaner or keeper has misplaced or moved a toy, the child goes into a literal temper tantrum. The obsessive compulsive kids are they cannot take transitions. They tend to have germ phobias, so they're often very afraid to socialize and be near other children or touch certain things. Some of them, even by the time they get to be 9 or 10, know the concept of hygiene. They will start washing their hands many, many times a day. I had one child who was very terrible. It was really just very sad. The child was so germphobic he would not leave the house.
Okay, some other anxiety disorders that we talk about. School avoidance.
To go to school, how would you approach or treat that so you would probably go back to school?
A good portion of these cases can be resolved by what we call gradual reintroduction to school. They go for the first day, they meet with the guidance counselor, they go for an hour or two of classes, they perhaps even meet with the guidance counselor and spend a half a day in school. They do that for a week. The next week they do a little bit more time in the school. And that will help a good portion of those kids. Some of the kids really do need some kind of therapy. They need to have what we call cognitive behavioral therapy, where they really learn strategies about how to recognize and deal with your fears, what we also call it correcting a mistaken belief. There's usually some kind of belief system that kids developed that something poor or bad is going to happen in school. So you get to that with them. But when it's a severe case, sometimes you have to actually give them alternative education. They may need to be in a smaller classroom setting. They may need to have one of the things that's been found to be very successful with some of the more severe cases is actually homeschooling. And sometimes medication is used, but none of the strategies, there's no one strategy, none of them really stand out as being significantly successful across the board with school refusal.
Okay, another type of anxiety disorder that we talk about is post-traumatic stress syndrome. We think of this more with adults who've been in war situations, but it actually can affect children.
We know that children view and see adults in their lives as role models, and so they're watching these ways of interacting. Parents think that they can and are often in denial about how much their children are really being exposed to the violence, thinking that perhaps their children don't know about what's going on. But in fact, children, if they're not directly witnessing the violence, are hearing it, or perhaps at least experiencing the effects in their interactions with their parents. For example, a mom who might really want to be there for her child, if she's having to worry about her own safety, then it may be hard to do that. We know that the effects of witnessing domestic violence can be as detrimental as being the direct victim of abuse, and that's in terms of long-term psychological and behavioral effects. We think of PTSD, we kind of equate it with veterans returning from war, but children who witness violence chronically in their environment develop some of the symptoms of PTSD, things like having a foreshortened view of the future, feeling that you really don't have a future. These are children who just don't think that they have very long to live. Second is emotional numbing to the outside world. So these are children who have difficulty, for example, with spontaneous play. And third is experiencing flashbacks of the violence that they've witnessed and that they've experienced. Because the symptoms of having witnessed violence are not specific, there really has to be a high degree of suspicion in identifying some of the symptoms, asking about exposure to violence. So asking parents and children, hey, does your child watch violence on television? What about in your neighborhood? I have found that many children are repeatedly exposed to hearing gunshots in their environment. So important to start asking these questions about exposure to violence in one's surroundings, and then asking about violence exposure at home.
In addition to anxiety disorders, we also have what we call mood disorders. There are two major types, depression and bipolar disorder.
Do kids get depressed?
Again, I'm going to say increasingly over the years that I practice, I've been doing this practice for about 30 years now, but especially the last 15 years, more and more we get kids coming in with what I call classic adult depression. We were taught back in the 70s and 80s that children are going to present who are depressed, are going to present mainly with behavior problems, irritability. They're not going to particularly mention being sad. They're not going to talk about having suicidal ideations. Well, as the last 10, 12 years have gone on, I find I get young children coming in, even as young as 5, 6, 7, 8, saying things that they don't want to live. They're depressed, they're sad, they're not interested. This is a real key thing. They're not interested in socializing with. They already have friends, but they're now no longer interested in their friends. They don't want to hang out with them. And they have no interest even in common activities that they used to be very. The kid was a great tennis player, whatever. He suddenly has lost all interest in it. And they're sad.
Some of the medications you can use can actually make them have high suicide thoughts. So most of them have a contraindication under the age of 18. Doesn't mean you can't use it. That's a big red flag. You agree or disagree with it?
Oh, yes. It's been very well researched that if a child is started on antidepressant for depression, yes, they have to be very closely monitored, especially to see their reactions and to see if their suicidal ideation potential starts to increase. So you assess it. I'm finding myself more and more asking younger and younger children things like, do you have thoughts of harming yourself? Do you have a plan? Did you ever have thoughts of dying? It's an increasing problem.
I was talking to the kids depressed and has suicide thoughts, and you think they're legit. That's called a medical emergency. You do not sit in that. You contact your primary caretaker, maybe a psychiatrist, and probably, if you really think it through, to an ER to get it assessed by a psychiatrist. No, this kid's not going to do something, because those kids do it. You know, especially a male with it, because males are more successful than females. You got a big problem you do not put off next week, the week after. Is that correct?
And then we have bipolar disorder.
A lonely girl stands alone, not a friend and a cold, cold soul. My friend says, like, everybody has a teeny piece of bipolar. I'm like, not really. That's just normal. That's just, everybody has feelings. The worst part of having bipolar disorder is when I feel like I want to scream and burning and angry. I might say things I don't mean. The opposite feeling is when I feel really happy and excited and all tingly and smiley. But when I have the mood things, it feels like clouds, sort of. The rain cloud is a sad cloud. Thunder and lightning is the angry cloud, and the rainbow is the excited one. It's not a cloud, but it's related to weather. It's your plate, Melanie. Okay. Do you want any sugar with your shake? Yes, please. I love sugar. Yeah, I can tell because I get so hyper. I remember feeling like I was a bad kid because, yeah, I just did feel like that. I was scared that I was gonna die. I was just always afraid of dying. And later I was really happy and thought I was going to go on a tire swing to Princess Land. I sometimes feel like when I take the medicine, like I'm more boring and don't like believe in magic and stuff. And sometimes I feel sad about that. Well, I still believe in magic, but sometimes it just feels like that.
In the next set on this particular chapter, we'll see a few more videos and then we'll talk some more about other issues in the area of emotional and behavior disorders.